Hello and welcome to Identirati Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue. And this week we're going to be talking about debunking misconceptions about passkeys. And I have as guests Tim Capelli and from Okta and Matthew Miller from Cisco/Duo. Welcome, guys.
Thanks a lot.
Hey, Mike, thanks.
Yeah, it's great being here. Thanks for asking us.
And maybe we could just start. I bet when you went to college, Tim, you didn't think you were going to be a passkey guru. Maybe in 3 chapters, how did your career turn and you find yourself as on a passkey live stream?
Yeah, so I have a very weird background. I went to school for broadcast production, like TV production, like directing sports and that kind of stuff. At the time, that was becoming more and more automated, where like a room of like 7 people was going to go down to 1. So I saw the writing on the wall. I was always kind of a tech nerd, always learning things. And so I went back to the college that I went to school, worked in IT there, built out their new state-of-the-art Wi-Fi network, which was brand new at the time. And then got into kind of the traditional sysadmin stuff, AD, certificate services, Radius, all that fun stuff. That's where I kind of learned kind of the original learning of identity, I guess. And then I transitioned into the partner type scenario, right? Like pre-sales, technical for network policy and network security. So I kind of had a pretty big network identity background. And then went to that vendor called Aruba, which got bought by HPE, and then transitioned to kind of modern identity, I guess, when I went to Microsoft as a standards architect. And about a year in, I started working on WebAuthn and FIDO, and we started talking to some of our peers on the platform level of like, how can we actually make WebAuthn real, right? Like people aren't using this; it has some flaws, and that was kind of how Passkeys were born. And we started working with FIDO, and 2002 rolled around, and we announced all this. So.
How about you, Matt? How did you end up getting directed into FIDO and passkeys?
It was total serendipity. I've been doing web development basically all my life, and came from the world of consulting for the last few years prior to joining Cisco. 2019, I discovered WebAuthn through webauthn.io, and had like the perfect combination of hardware to play around with it, and just something sort of like clicked in my mind, like this is a really cool technology. And this was way before any hype. It was, there had been so many gravestones of all the previous attempts to get rid of passwords, but something about WebAuthn just was really intriguing to me personally. So dove super deep into it. I ended up writing a library called Simple WebAuthn and approaching WebAuthn from like the developer/RP side of things. And coincidentally, in early 2020, Duo was trying to staff its passwordless team, and I had met a mutual acquaintance who was at Duo at the time, and so my name got put forward, and so they asked me, do you want to come do WebAuthn at Cisco? And I was like, well, okay, sure. So that was my pivot into security, which was totally unexpected because I have a international business degree with a foreign language minor, and yeah, so here I find myself into WebAuthn, and I just dove super deep into it. I am the maintainer of Duo's WebAuthn library, PyWebAuthn. I am the current steward of webauthn.io, which appears on a lot of places, surprisingly. And yeah, now I'm kind of fighting for RPs in the passkey space, because of just how things have shifted with the introduction of sync passkeys, for example, and then yeah, just kept going. Got deeply involved in W3C and the FIDO Alliance on the spec side of things. So I'm an active participant, especially on the W3C side. But now I also am a board member representing Cisco on the FIDO Alliance. So yeah, I bet pretty big on passkeys, and it seems like it's kind of paying off.
Yeah. So, okay, well, I hope we're streaming now. I did start it a couple of seconds early, which was the first time I've done this. So if you're just joining us, welcome. We have Tim Capelli and Matthew from Okta, and Matthew Miller from Cisco. We just heard about a little bit about backgrounds, but we're going to jump now into the topic of the day. And I just want to ask everybody before we dive in today to remember to follow Identirati Office Hours on LinkedIn. We're trying to build up the followers. That way you'll get event notifications about all the great events. So today we're going to talk about misconceptions about FIDO, and we started on this. It was started out as an informal list, and it's getting a little more fleshed out. And we're just going to go through this list. So I'm going to start. The first misconception is user verification is DRM. I'm going to start with Tim to. I mean, I don't even know how to debunk it, because I guess I'm wondering why people would think digital rights management and FIDO overlap. But maybe Tim, you could take that one.
Yeah, I mean, I was a little surprised by this one as well. So there's a community of folks who believe, right, like that only me as the user should be in control of whether I'm challenged for another verification method, right? And the reason user verification exists, it's what makes a passkey multi-factor, if we're using kind of the old school terminology, right? Like I don't think anyone wants you. I don't think anyone, if they drop their security key on the ground, for someone to be able to pick it up and instantly gain access to all the accounts, right? Like that would be very, very bad, right? So I don't think Matt or I can explain why someone would equate UV to DRM. I think it's just the generic sense of like someone else is telling me I need to do UV, and so that is like DRM. I don't know. It was probably the most bizarre one I've seen so far. At least a lot of the other questions we're gonna talk about today, like totally could see how someone could come to that conclusion. This one was really wild. So UV is for your own protection to get into your accounts.
Okay, Nat, passkeys are not DRM, but the next one, I think we've seen some real misconceptions about. It's passkeys are just big tech lock-in, and I understand there's a new FIDO Alliance standard called CXP, but I remember there was a Proton blog about this. Matt, maybe you can take it, because I think it's a substantive topic that I think people don't have clear. So are passkeys just big tech lock-in?
So we've had synced passkeys for about a year and a half now, between a year and a half and 2 years right now. And from the very early days, a very common refrain was that, oh, I can't use my chosen, we call them passkey providers now, but I can't use my chosen thing to manage my passkey lifecycle. Clearly, this is Apple and Google just trying to own login. And the intention, speaking as an insider at all this, the intention from the very beginning was never that there was going to be lock-in. It's just people that, so the idea that this is lock-in is that once you create a passkey with Google Password Manager, with iCloud Keychain, that there is no way to move it from one to the other. And so people saw this as Google and Apple intentionally hamstringing synced passkeys to keep users in their ecosystem, because if you can't move your passkeys, you're not going to be able to go from your iPhone to an Android phone. But the fact of the matter is, the majority of people in their lives never contemplate migrating platforms once they've picked it. Your grandfather who's been using an iPhone for all of his life because he ended up with one at some point, like how many people actually want to go through and burn the social capital of moving them over to an entirely different platform? A huge learning curve with it. People are comfortable with the type of phone they have, and when they upgrade, they're more likely than not going from one model to an upgraded model of the same ecosystem. You consider iOS or Android ecosystems, for example.
Sorry, can I interject one question? Wouldn't the same issue exist for password managers themselves?
Right, like the lock-in comes from an inability to move stuff around, and password managers, probably in the early days of that, if we went back far enough, we'd probably see a lot of those same arguments. However, nowadays, password manager migration is a thing. The nice thing that I'm happy to announce, or maybe I didn't want to turn this into an announcement, but a nice thing that's come out of the passkey ecosystem in 2024, just last month actually, is this series, this family of standards called the Credential Exchange Protocol. And the idea is that behind the scenes, for just about a year now, 1Password and Dashlane, under the FIDO Alliance, have been working very closely on creating a standard that other companies can implement, an open standard called Credential Exchange Protocol. And the idea is that today, migrating your passwords often involves like a clear text state where your passwords and all your secrets kind of reside unprotected as you're migrating them from one password manager to another. The idea is that private key bytes, the information in the private key, you don't want to do that. And so how do we securely move your private key data from one provider to another? The answer to that is encapsulated within the credential exchange protocol. So the FIDO Alliance has recently published a working draft version of like the initial version of this, but 1Password and Dashlane, since they worked on it, they have shown demonstrations of this in action, being able to move a passkey from one passkey provider to another. And so now it's just a matter of time before first-party providers, Google, Apple, Microsoft, before they incorporate it as well. And this becomes a meaningful solution to people that claim that there's big vendor lock-in. It's like, no, these companies want you to be able to move your data where you want to manage them. And the reality is we're going to get that sooner than later. It's coming very soon.
Yeah,
Tim, do you have anything to add to that?
yeah, just
Because
throwing
it
my
does
hat out,
sound
like,
like
yeah,
it's a
yeah, I was
little
gonna say,
true,
like,
right?
from majority of my time working on Passkeys was at Microsoft, right, a platform, and like one other angle, right? I think people were frustrated that like the capability came out of the box first, right? And the reality is that like most users don't want to pay or set up another service, right? So like the thing you buy for a lot of money has to come with a basic set of capabilities. If we want to remove passwords from the world, well, your device needs to be able to do this stuff natively out of the box without doing anything else, right? That is the reality. Like you don't buy a laptop and have to like go find a Wi-Fi driver anymore, right? Like unless you're like building your own machine, right? Like these are just not like we can never get to a point where this is a default credential for the web if users have to tinker and set up things and lose. Like it's just not how the average user thinks. I think so much of these topics we're going to keep covering today are like tech people being in a bubble, right? Like we are not normal users. Users don't think about any of this stuff, right? Like almost all of the hostility and like is like really nerdy. No offense, we're all nerds. Like nerdy people with nerd problems, right? Which aren't realistic problems in the short term, right? Of course, yes, migration is important, but very, 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 very few people, as Matt mentioned, is that a day one problem. It's not, right? Like I think people are hung up on the notion that you can't, right? Like that I'm not going to do this thing because I'm being locked in. And that's why we've tried to be very vocal that like this thing is being worked on. And of course, no one believes you until there's something to see. And that's why we got a very, very early draft of this spec out because FIDO typically doesn't release a draft this early, but it was really important that people realize this is real and that like all of the big players are participating and communicating, right? So it's just like the reason I've been really hot on this topic is like all of us in the nerd bubble talk to other people, right? And if everyone's screaming that passkeys are bad because of these things that only a small group really care about, it obviously affects like the image of all this technology, right? And so that's why it's, you know, a lot of people tell me like, why are you worrying about it? It's such a small people. It's the Hacker News crowd. Yeah, but again, they have friends and they talk to everyone, and they are making it onto the top of Hacker News that people read, and it comes into a Google search, right? It's really important that we address like these concerns head on and make sure people are aware that it is being worked on. Like it is not malintent. You know, there's no malintent here. It's just timelines, right? Another big piece, having worked at Microsoft, right? Getting Microsoft, Google, and Apple to align on timelines, yeah, right. It'll never happen, right? Like it's so we're in this like first 5 years, right? Where, you know, things are probably this year, I would say is the first time things are getting very close to aligning in terms of user experience capabilities, you know, even default services, right? So it just takes time. It's like any new technology. And it is important that, you know, we don't have a huge crowd with pitchforks saying like, don't use this thing. It's just to lock you in or something, because it's not true, right? So.
Yeah. Well, isn't there a basic engineering principle that we want to work on the features that are going to have a positive impact to the most people first?
Exactly.
And then we'll go ahead and start covering some of those additional corner cases. So I think it aligns perfectly with how we should be rolling out.
Yeah.
And I think one of the themes of this conversation is going to be you're projecting something onto Passkeys it wasn't designed to actually solve. And so it doesn't actually do that. But one of the misconceptions is that passkeys are proprietary. And I think there is some black magic behind, let's say, the keychains themselves and how the operators operate those keychains. But are passkeys themselves somehow proprietary, Tim?
And just for a quick refresher on terminology, right? A passkey is just the name of a credential. It also happens to be represented as like this whole new experience that we have, right? So it's kind of two different things. But at the end of the day, it's just what we used to call a WebAuthn discoverable credential, which obviously no one actually calls it that. But it is a WebAuthn credential. It uses the WebAuthn API. I think where in multiple areas, including some new work we're doing with the digital credentials API, I think a lot of folks don't realize there's like a layer kind of between the web platform and everything else, and that's the app platform, right? So these WebAuthn API, for example, only defines behavior in a web browser. Anything that happens at the OS level, which includes like interactions with a native app, that is like native OS code with native APIs. Now, the nice thing, and this is predates Passkeys, is all of the platform APIs that exist are almost clones of the WebAuthn API, which is by design, right? Same input, same outputs. Obviously, the naming slightly different and the methods are different because like those are native things on each platform. But like same input, same outputs, your server can generally handle them the exact same way with maybe one or two small tweaks. And so like I think that black box, for lack of a better term, the platform is where people think it's proprietary. But at the end of the day, the thing gets from A to B, and as long as both are standards compliant, it works, right? Like the authenticators themselves, the insides of them, sure, are proprietary, but that's not new, right? A YubiKey, right? All the insides of how a YubiKey works is proprietary to Yubico, right? There are a few vendors out there like SoloKey who open source their firmware, and that's great, but that's not expected, right? Like there are benefits and downsides of open source security firmware, right? Like I'm sure a lot of people have opinions on that, but like it's all about the plumbing and making sure that like when a user kicks off a flow, everything works, right? Like one of the goals with all this, and it might seem kind of marketing-y, but like was making sure there was like an icon that represents Passkeys, right? Like if you go to a store and you see the POS terminal and you see the little tap to pay icon, most users at this point, it's been about 10 years, but most users know not necessarily how it works, but they know what experience to expect. They know they can tap their phone or tap their card. And like that, we needed that for the web, right? So that's why the name and the term, right, passkey and the icon are really important. So users don't need to understand how it works. They don't need to know all the inside baseball of how it works, but they need to know that they're going to get a certain experience, right? And that's why you've seen dialogues changing, right? It's not because we want to confuse users. It's because there's been a lot of user research that's gone into making sure like options that confuse people go away, right? And now, like I know that was one of the ones you mentioned is like the dialogues that are inconsistent, and that's a little bit in this, as I mentioned, the kind of the 5-year window of optimizing, right? We're optimizing, right? Like the goal is that the user just gets what they're expecting every time, right? In the next 6 months or so, you'll start to see a lot more like proactive context that wasn't available before. One example, right? Soon you will see in Chrome that if you have a passkey on your Android phone, right, in the autofill UI, instead of you having to guess that it's on my Android phone, it'll say passkey for the site on Pixel 8, right? And you just tap it, and then you get a pop-up on your phone, and away you go, right? So slowly kind of bringing in context that wasn't available, especially pre-passkeys, right? Like the autofill UI, for example, that was not something that existed before. Maybe the old kind of world of WebAuthn would have been more successful if some of these features were there. But we think kind of all of this coming together, right? And again, none of it's proprietary. Like these experiences are all driven by things in WebAuthn or WebAuthn derived specs. And that's what brings the experience end to end, right? Like only like half of the world is standards, half of it is how you implement the standard, right? As I'm sure many people know on this call.
Right. Matt, maybe is there anything you want to say on that topic? And can I actually add a follow-up question in here, which is, should we just stop saying FIDO and start saying passkeys? So I was talking with one of the industry experts on this, and he was advising Glue to rename our FIDO component, our passkey component. And in that sense, it's open. But so any thoughts on passkeys, proprietary elements, or if you could maybe just comment, should we stop saying FIDO altogether and just start saying passkey?
So on the first topic of the question of proprietary, how proprietary is passkeys, excuse me, there's a lot of moving pieces in play here, and the most proprietary aspect of passkeys is honestly how the syncing occurs. That is, every platform has its own sync mechanism. Every provider has its own sync mechanism, and there's no meaningful way to define common behavior there, let alone enforce it. And that's the enforcement is probably the biggest thing that prevents a lot of things from being quote unquote standardized in a spec. It's just like how do you get Apple and Google to do exactly what the spec says if Apple and Google don't like it? So there's a lot of there's always this act of trying to figure out what you can define as a standard and interoperable behavior, and what you leave up to the implementers of these of these standards. So in this case, like the core, the fundamental building blocks of how WebAuthn is used to secure login, that's standardized, and that is why we have interoperability across platforms and browsers. But how iCloud Keychain syncs your passkey, how Google Password Manager syncs your passkey, like leave those up to the big companies, because the technologies they could use to protect those could change over time, and if you actually tried to codify something like that, that could backfire in the long run. Now, to excuse me, to your other question about whether or not to just call them passkeys. Passkeys is useful for like user-facing UI, I would say, for documentation that's intended for users, for iconography, and for referring to what they're about to do when you're trying to prime the user for success. Yes, absolutely. Call it a passkey. Don't tell them, complete a FIDO2 based authentication. Like, that doesn't mean anything to anybody, because nobody else is talking about this as a FIDO2 thing. Yes, behind the scenes, if you are technically inclined or you need to do a deep dive, you probably want to sprinkle FIDO2 into your search, your internet searches, because you'll find relevant stuff. FIDO2 is sort of the umbrella term for WebAuthn, managed by the W3C, and CTAP, which is managed by FIDO, and they come together to enable passkeys. But just call passkeys everything. If you have a code base where nobody is going to be seeing your code and you call it a FIDO thing, like, leave it. It doesn't. You're not going to generate meaningful value by renaming your code if it exists already. But if it's net new, or it's something that's shown to the user, I think it's useful to call it passkeys, for just to help everybody understand it's the same thing no matter what website you're on.
Can we just pivot to biometrics? One of the misconceptions we have listed is that passkeys like steal your biometrics, or they what's the other way it's phrased? Passkeys sync biometric data. To me, it seemed obvious that the design of passkeys was that the client-side modality of the biometric is not really like. But maybe you want to. We can just quickly boot that one out. Do passkeys like steal your biometrics, or server-side store your biometrics?
No, the biometric patterns are captured by the device itself. They remain on the device, and exercising them requires physical access to the device. There is nothing in WebAuthn that transmits biometric data of any kind. All that is transmitted to a relying party, that is the website that's using passkeys, is whether or not the access device was able to locally verify the user's identity. So you get a true false, and that's it. You don't get anything.
Don't you get modality? Was it face? Was it thumb? Was it KB knowledge? I thought you get the modality.
There was an extension in WebAuthn that was called the user verification method that was intended to convey information like that. It didn't see meaningful adoption by anyone, and I think it's being removed from L3 draft, but it's kind of in this weird flux state because occasionally there's demand for it, but like I said, no meaningful adoption by any of the major platforms.
Well, yeah, and just to talk about that a little more, right? Like there is generally, from a large number of members of the people who make passkeys work, right? No, it doesn't matter what role you're in. There is not a huge appetite to continue adding features that allow a user to get stuck in a state where they can't authenticate, right? So the fear with UVM is like, device PIN is a perfectly valid user verification method, right? It is device bound. It is tied to an unlock mechanism on the device. It is not a password, and it is perfectly valid for user verification. And the minute that gets exposed to relying parties, you again leave users without a way to authenticate, right? This is kind of the core theme. Even thinking about, I don't want to go into it too deep here, but like, why aren't passkeys attested? Well, the fear right now is, right, if everyone discriminates on what provider you're allowed to use, everyone will just say, we're only going to allow iCloud Keychain and Google Password Manager. And so the users that don't have that or choose not to use that, right, then users are stuck. We cannot kill passwords if users are left with no other alternative than passwords. So like, if you don't like the provider that the user is doing, that's fine. Do something else after. Never reject the request, with the exception of like workforce and enterprise. That's a whole other beast. But in consumer scenarios, right, like there is no case where a passkey is worse than a password. No case, period, right? Like fundamentally. So like that's the fear of exposing too much metadata northbound, is like Like, how is this going to be used for discriminating and leaving the user in a state where ultimately it's the user that gets screwed, right? So, sorry, that was a little.
And I want to, can I add one thing to that as well? Like to Tim's point about the protection, like whether or not it's meaningful to offer a biometric only user verification, some kind of flag, and like WebAuthn does not give you that level of control. And I want to reiterate that the reason WebAuthn does not have a biometric only mode is because the PIN is the fundamental protection to the enrollment of a biometric pattern into your authenticator device. So like an attacker that has your PIN can defeat biometric only authentication by simply registering their face as a new biometric pattern on the device, and then they're going to be able to log in as the user. So like that PIN really is the privileged thing to protect, and biometric is a convenience over PIN entry. So it's important to keep that PIN secure.
Tim, you mentioned workforce and enterprise. Um, in my conversations with enterprise, I think that enterprises project a little bit of passkeys becoming some type of panacea where they're not going to have to worry about authentication. Yep. What are some of the new requirements for enterprises that they'll have to think about? Are there any parallels between maybe each app having passkey registrations and passwords? So what are the new things that enterprises are going to need to do to manage these passkeys?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of like 911 alarms went out with enterprise and passkeys, which is surprising to me because there's actually a whole new set of capabilities that were never possible before, right? Like the large majority of organizations that haven't deployed passkeys, it's because they don't want to buy FIDO security keys for bootstrapping, or they don't want to, they don't have the capability to manage a device, right? So they were left with no solution there, right? Other than to use terrible experiences for their users. The new piece that we have is that on an unmanaged device, you can have a passkey provider that's a workforce passkey provider. Imagine just theoretically Microsoft Authenticator, Okta Verified, Duo Mobile, right? All these solutions that users probably already have on their device. Well, guess what? Now that can be a passkey provider for workforce that can have the security requirements you need, like device-bound passkeys and ensuring certain security levels and honestly getting you all the way to AAL3, which is incredible. And we never had this before. The only option was deploy security keys, right? So I see this as an incredible opportunity for enterprise. And like, you should push your IDaaS vendors to build these solutions, right? I think we're going to be in a world in 5 years where your enterprise identity provider provides you a passkey provider that your users use. And that's okay. Like, let's not make consumer passkeys so incredibly difficult that like we blow up like all this good work because like enterprises don't have what they need from a consumer grade passkey, right? So like, I'm not saying there's not work to do, right? There are going to be tons of organizations that a consumer grade passkey is perfectly good, right? What I found working at Microsoft is people tend to bucket like this one size fits all approach, especially for FIDO, right? Like, and some of this is because of the way products have been built that only allow you to configure one size fits all policies. But every organization outside of government, I will caveat, has a large group of users that a consumer grade synced passkey is perfectly adequate. The people will only need to access their paycheck or timesheet. The people don't have access to anyone else's information, right? Like students at a university, those are workforce deployments. They're not employees, but it's a workforce deployment. And there's a lot of opportunities to step up, right? Students just use their consumer sync passkey. Great. Students who are student workers who have access to other data, maybe they have to install this app on their device, but their device isn't managed. And now they have an enterprise grade passkey. And then people on a work managed, university managed device, they just get all the native stuff you get automatically from device bound passkeys and all the fun stuff you get when you manage a device, right? So we have more opportunities than ever. So I am a little sad that there's so much negativity around this because like there's more possibilities than we've ever had before and people are building them, right? Like as Libby mentioned in the chat, Microsoft just released device bound passkeys and authenticator. That's amazing, right? Like it's like a whole new set of possibilities that weren't there before that all use standard protocols that are interoperable. Like it's amazing, right? Like, so I'll let Matt chime in a little bit. But.
Yeah.
Matt, I was going to say, yeah, as working at Cisco Duo, you probably have some thoughts about enterprise and passkey. So love to hear your thoughts.
Right. There's an entire, there was a very useful analogy that I heard. These numbers are very outdated because this was about a 1.5 to 2-year-old analogy at this point. But WebAuthn passkeys are so compelling as an authentication method because you can sort of break up, you can bucket internet users into sort of 3 different buckets. 75% of internet users are not protected by any second factor authentication of any kind. They're just username and password. Something like 20% are using SMS OTP as their second factor authentication, phishable second factor authentication. Then 5%, your final 5%, 75, 25%, yeah, is protected by actual true, MFA, TOTP, push, those kinds of things. WebAuthn, therefore, represents an immense elevation of security posture for 90 up to potentially 95% of internet users by giving faster, more secure authentication to those users that are not protected by second factor, and completely removes phishing and SMS bills from organizations that use SMS OTP as their second factor authentication. And like the combination of more secure and faster is almost unheard of. And it's just unbelievable that we have this technology available now across all the major platforms, across everybody's, like 96, I think FIDO Alliance in May just put out numbers that said 96 to 98% of mobile devices and browsers that are out there today can use WebAuthn, can use Passkeys. And like that just is mind-blowing how close we
They
are.
used to show a triangle that showed basically, and Microsoft did a study years ago, and they said usability, security, deployability, and they said you can choose one of the other of those, but you always get worse. Somehow, passkeys cheat because you get better usability and better security, and somehow you don't give up in deployability. So somehow they cheated. They cheated by building this infrastructure up from the hardware through the operating system, through the browser, through the WebAuthn standard. So it's taken 10 years of work to do that cheat. But I do think you're right that it is it is sort of magic that somehow you're able to get better usability and security at the same time.
And not to over-index too much on this topic of enterprise, but like I want to emphasize the fact that there is a spectrum of passkey deployment where bog standard, unattested, synced passkey deployment by any website that wants to use it is so immensely more secure that like everyone should be doing it and not caring how the person leverages synced passkeys. For most consumer websites, for your Bob's Bait and Tackle or whatever, that just needs to be able to do secure login, like go ahead and deploy that. For enterprises that are all the way on the other side of this spectrum, that need to know like down to the access device, down to the authenticator, and assign them one-to-one to a user, those kinds of things are meaningfully available. And synced passkeys brokered by an IDP-provided passkey provider application offer a level of control that we previously only had with security keys, but the convenience of platform authenticators. And I think it's up to the organization to sort of explore that spectrum where they are on it. But I would hazard to say most are on this consumer ease of use side of things. Would be best served by that.
Yeah.
Tim, I want to let you comment on that, but I also wanted to pivot in a second to federated login. But go ahead. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, just one interesting problem with on the enterprise side is there are many cases where even a synced passkey is better than what you've rolled out today because it's phishing resistant, but there's some regulation that says you're not allowed to use it because it takes 10 years to update these regulations, right? So that's the other thing that has to happen, and we need everyone's help doing, right? Like there are regulations out that say like a password plus SMS is fine, but you cannot use a synced passkey, and the SMS is only there because the password's phishable. It makes absolutely no sense, right? Like so that is part of the problem, and that's not a technology problem, unfortunately. That's the way the world works problem that we need to collectively work together to address.
I completely agree. I want to show a quick, this is a modal window pop-up from Chrome that I got. And it's kind of interesting because, okay, now in my mind, I'm thinking, select a passkey. I can choose iCloud or my Chrome profile. My first comment is that these are different things. I would say it's not Google keychain, it's Chrome keychain. So the branding there is a little confusing. But it sort of maybe I would think that this is something like social login. And so I think one of the conceptions is that this passkey is going to come with my Gmail ID, or it doesn't come with any claims. But I think there's a misconception that somehow passkeys are a new type of federated login.
Yeah, so that just real quick on that dialogue, right? Like that dialogue is essentially asking where you want to save it, right? And the Chrome profile thing is a legacy thing, right? Like before passkeys were a thing, right? You could before, like this is on Mac OS, I assume, right? So Mac OS didn't have a platform authenticator for a long time. So the nice thing with the web platform, because it's pretty complex and is kind of like its own little mini platform on top, they built their own authenticator built into WebAuthn where you can just create a passkey and it's stored securely within your Chrome profile. So that is there because it was always there. And there are organizations that use it. That is not speaking for Google, but that will not be there forever. Like, highly recommend you do not use it actually. But the idea there is like that will continue to grow, right? As you install, like, let's say 1Password on your Mac or your Windows device, right? You'll start to see those in there, right? The enabled providers, right? Because that's giving you user choice on where you want to save it. Now, that is only on creation, right? Like someone actually mentioned in the comments, right? The creation flows can be a little bit more confusing. And there is only, to be honest, so much we can do to make creation flows easier, right? Like if we do want to give the user choice on where to create it, we have to prompt them, right? And this is a very similar conversation we're having in the wallet space, right? Like users don't think about wallets or credential providers during authentication or presentation, but they do think about them if they want to save it in a different place to start, right? So there's a ton of intelligence on the authentication side, right? Like the client, the WebAuthn client is the browser, and the platform helps mediate through some of the credential providers. There's a lot of kind of intelligence that can happen there to help put in front of the user the fact that they have a credential and they don't have to worry about where it is. That's not really a concept on create because you have to ask the user where to put it. Now, if the user only had one enabled provider, then sure, everything just goes into the default bucket. Small pitch, if you're going to authenticate, I'm gonna have a whole session on like these modals and why they behave a certain way. But the crossover with federation, it comes up a lot because there's another account involved, right? And as you mentioned, there's no claims, right? Passkeys are the big difference between passkeys and like an ID token or a verifiable credential is there's no claims. It's a pairwise key that is unique to the device, right? And that's why they are complementary.
No claims and no biometric templates.
Yeah, right. And so like the world. So let me explain why they're not, and then I'll talk about my ideal world. Is they're not federation, right? Like at the end of the day, like federation is incredibly privacy invasive for consumers, right? Like that IDP knows everywhere you're going at every time. And there's very little that can be done today with the existing federation model that can be done to change that, right? Like you are ultimately saying, I trust this provider to know everything I'm doing. And most users don't understand that. They don't fully comprehend that when they click on continue as me, that like.
And that's a good thing in the enterprise environment where we want accountability and
exactly. And enterprise, it's by design. And that's the difference with Passkeys, right? Like your provider account, right? Your passkey provider account is literally just used to store a blob of encrypted data, right? Like these are end-to-end encrypted. You should always pick a passkey provider that's end-to-end encrypted. There's a certification program coming around those security requirements. Most of the I would say the top 10 providers out there, including default providers, are end-to-end encrypted. So it's just using that account to store an encrypted blob of data so that when you get a new device, they all come back to the other device and your device decrypts it, right? So if you've actually set up a new device post passkeys, you get asked for your screen lock or some other recovery factor, in some cases even a security key if you have a high security account to recover that blob. So it is fundamentally not federation, right? Like there's no relationship between those accounts that you're signing into other sites and your provider account. Now the intersection with federation is really interesting, and time box me on this because I could go for an hour. The world I want to see is that you sign up with federation, right? So you create your account saying, I want to get my name, email, phone number, verified email, and even verified age from, let's say, signing with Google. And the next step is automatically it creates a passkey. And now you sever that relationship with the federated IDP from then on out, and you use your passkey from then on out. So you get the ease of use of federation. Most users use continue with XYZ provider because they don't have to type anything. And you end up with a passkey, and now you don't have these privacy challenges. Now, verifiable credentials are another great alternative, right? Arguably, verifiable credentials are federation. It's a three-party model for federation, right? So
yeah, I was gonna go there with how in a way verifiable credentials use the authentication and then add claims. And I think we shouldn't go down that rabbit hole because that's probably another 45 minutes.
Sure.
Matt, maybe I could maybe you have some thoughts on this topic of passkeys and federation. And I want to also throw at you the next topic, which is passkeys require my phone every time?
Sure. So quickly on the topic of federation with passkeys, nothing about passkeys is trying to do away with federation. There's still this model where you can still have a sign in with X service, or for enterprises, you can still benefit from passkey authentication by setting up your IAM provider to authenticate with passkeys. And so yeah, you're still doing SSO redirects over to do your passwordless authentication with passkeys, and then going back. And that is a meaningful way for an organization that is currently engaged with a company like Duo or Okta or Entra to configure their protections to benefit from passkeys without having to actually become experts in how to properly implement and get their users onboarded. They can request their IDP to handle that. So yeah, there's
And that's one of the main benefits of having an IDP, is that your IDP can centralize your authentication business logic.
Right,
including passkeys and everything else you support. Yeah.
So I just want a hot take and contradict Matt. I have full intention in the next 10 years to do everything I can to kill consumer federation with passkeys. Like, just to be very, like, it is not like that. It is a ripe technology to restore some of this privacy to users, right? Like, and it will work with it. But like, my goal is by 2030, right? Like, you no longer have to click sign in after you create an account. If you want to use it for sign up, great. But like, there's no more of this tracking you across the web based on sign in, right? So that's a personal goal.
It seems like that's related to the claims, because that only works if you don't need claims. And then, so it's not like passkeys are going to solve this. They're going to solve it when I don't want to give up my identity. But as soon as I need to present claims, then we really need to go to something like verified credentials.
Right,
yeah, but at the end of the day, like, most consumer federation cases, the claims aren't changing every time you sign in, right? They're static, right? Name, email, phone number, they're not changing, right? So if you need a proof up, sure, you can run through a flow again. It's completely unnecessary. It's a convenience factor, and passkeys are arguably more convenient, and we need to kill it.
Well, so and if the context was on consumer use cases, then that's my fault for talking about enterprise.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
For Tim's vision of the future, like, I 100% am on board with that. Like, I don't generally sign in with use sign in with, because first of all, if I get blocked out of that service for whatever reason with no recourse, I'm locked out of everything I'm signed into. But passkeys offer a degree of control over a simpler, stronger login that I don't think we've ever really had before.
Just to give a concrete example, I scanned a coupon at the grocery store at HEB to save $1 on yogurt, and they made me sign in. And I'm thinking, why am I creating all I need to be able to do is identify myself as a consumer. And then I started thinking, well, the reason they gave me the $1 off is because they want to know my information, because they're doing marketing research. So who knows how much, there's a need for this information.
Mike, I lost the lead on your second question.
Okay, so the second question was, passkeys basically are going to require me to present my phone every time, like even more reliant on my phone.
Right. Well, and the FIDO Alliance is investing a ton of money in the UX in their design guidelines for how to offer a pleasant end user experience for using FIDO2. And one of the things is, yes, in WebAuthn space, there is the capability of scanning a QR code with your mobile device to sign in on another device. This has been very useful for scenarios in which a passkey will not sync. For example, you have an Android device and you are on Windows. You currently don't have a way to offer syncing between those devices so that you can just use Windows Hello without anything extra step. But what the FIDO Alliance, their design guidelines offer guidance on how exactly you use that hybrid authentication with your mobile device to bootstrap registration on a new device, because you can sort of transfer trust to a new device you don't have a passkey on via this hybrid authentication. So the idea is, you're going to a website, oh, I can't use Windows Hello? All right, well, I have something on my Android device. I'm going to scan this QR code. I'm going to complete authentication. And then the website is going to have to wire up a thing going, hey, thanks for signing in. By the way, we noticed that you had to use another device. Do you want to sign in more quickly next time with this device? And the user goes, yes, of course I do, because it's going to be faster next time. And that is your that is your CTA to register something. So the user then has two passkeys. And then the next time they come and they sign in, they don't need their phone anymore. The phone is intended to be a bootstrapping mechanism. in call center scenarios. It's an awesome way to handle multiple users on the same endpoint without requiring everyone to like register a biometric or know a PIN or juggle anything like that. But by and large, for the most part, it should be a bootstrapping mechanism for a new device when syncing can occur.
So we're coming up on the end of this. I know Tim has a hard stop, and so I'm going to ask for final thoughts. But before I do that, I just want to remind everyone that the this live stream page, we can continue the conversation there. I unfortunately didn't have time to address all of the chat. I'm sorry, audience. I'm really bad at that. I'm trying to listen to the guests and not the chat, or otherwise I lose my train of thought. But we can use the chat to continue this discussion. We didn't have time to get the last two misconceptions, but I'm just going to switch over into last thoughts, and maybe Matt, we'll start with you, and we'll let Tim as a guest finish.
Sure. I am very bullish on Passkeys. I think we've seen tremendous evolution in the ecosystem in the last year and a half, 2 years. And the questions that people have, the frustrations that people have, we need to be careful that we need to acknowledge the fact that the majority of users are well served by the current capabilities of Passkeys. There are additional, more complex use cases that, like enterprise scenarios, that have kind of suffered since the introduction of sync Passkeys. But there's been a tremendous amount of effort that has gone into the FIDO Alliance and W3C side of things, especially on trying to offer those enterprises a path forward so that everybody, end-to-end, consumer and enterprise use cases alike, can benefit from Passkeys. So hang on there. Like, your frustrations are known. You're not the only one having those frustrations, and we're working on solving them.
Tim, last thoughts?
Yeah, I guess my call to action is just stay involved in the conversation, right? Like, passkeys.dev is a developer resource that Matt and I maintain. We're always looking for help. If you want to help, creating issues when you observe a weird thing that you want an answer to is helpful. Passkeys.dev/discuss is a GitHub discussion area that we'd love for people to start using to ask questions about deployments and security and other things. Just stay engaged, right? I think like everyone that I work with in this community is more than willing to jump on a call, jump on a chat, and have a conversation. We just it's unfortunate to see like these like really bad, like incorrect like rants on social media about passkeys that are just not correct, which led to a lot of this, right? So point people to these discussions, right? Point people to passkeys.dev, have them ask a question where like we know it will get the right eyes on it. Even if you have to create an issue in the WebAuthn repo and we'll redirect it, right? If all else fails. But and just on that last note, right? Like WebAuthn, W3C and the WebAuthn spec is really where everything happens, right? And you do not have to be a W3C member to share an idea or comment on an issue or a pull request, right? So that is a huge misconception. If you have something you want to see in the spec, create an issue for it or engage in the discussion there. We get a lot of feedback that this is like happening in private, and it's like literally the most opposite possible scenario. So please make your voice heard.
Well, Tim and Matthew, thank you so much for joining us today. A quick reminder to audience, please follow Identirati Office Hours on LinkedIn so you can get more great event notifications. Next week, Sebastian Rohr and Hank Marsman will be joining us. If you're a sad Identirati like me and couldn't make it to Berlin to EIC, we're gonna do a recap. Or if you need your last EIC fix, this is your maybe your next chance. So please join us. And again, Tim and Matthew, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Mike. Appreciate it.